the trial of Karen Reed for the death of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, is underway.
There are 17 jurors, and they're coming and going with a police escort.
I've seen a lot of things. I've never seen anything like this. This case never ceases to amaze me.
The first week of testimony has come to an end.
It's a spectacle, that's for sure.
We really heard the defense highlight some of the discrepancies between what was documented and what first responders said they remembered.
There are a lot of issues in this case.
Proctor was improperly searching Karen Reed's cell phone for nude photos.
The fact that the investigation wasn't thorough provides a big wrinkle in the prosecution's case.
They're supposed to be creating this reasonable doubt, and they're doing exactly that.
Everybody wants to know, us included, why he wouldn't go inside that home on the night that the body was discovered.
There are more people here at the beginning of this than at the beginning of Johnny Depp's trial.
It's always the theories or stories that each side will put forth, right, for a jury to listen to and decide which one is more believable.
We asked Karen Reed about that alleged confession. Karen, did you ever say I hit him?
I did not.
The FBI is investigating an investigation of a murder. That never, ever happens.
Karen Reed was drunk and angry and hit and killed John O'Keefe when she gunned it in the snowstorm.
We're looking at arm injuries with scratches. We're not looking at tire tracks.
I did not kill John O'Keefe. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head.
Defense attorneys learn in school, first class, the most important thing you can do is identify and select stupid juries.
We're not concerned about any of the witnesses. None of the Commonwealth's witnesses are concerning us.
Karen Reed is facing up to life in prison.
I just hope justice is served for either one, whatever it is, you know.
The fate of her life is not in her hands anymore. It's not in the hands of her attorneys. It's not in the hands of the prosecutor. It's in the hands of the jury now.
Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed!
The jury in the trial against Karen Reed listened to a total of 74 witnesses between April 29th and June 24th, 2024. We heard from Officer John O'Keefe's family and friends, first responders, 7 members of the Albert family and 3 members of the McCabe family, Higgins, and everyone who was at 34 Fairview Road that night, doctors, data experts, police, and more. There have been debates over Google searches, whether Karen told people I hit him or asked if she did, solo cups, missing and inverted videos, and what, if anything, everyone drank that night. They listened as the prosecution and defense gave 2 very different versions of events based on the evidence, and now they're listening to Massachusetts State Police Trooper Joe Paul tell them the version of events from when he says Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe with her SUV and left him to die in the cold. Trooper Michael Proctor took on this case in the morning, and he decided Karen Reed was guilty by that evening, without having ever gone to the scene where John O'Keefe was found. 3 days later, on February 1st, Trooper Joe Paul does some testing and analysis on Karen Reed's SUV. A probable cause affidavit, or PCA, application is dated, signed, and filed, and Karen Reed is arrested at her home in Mansfield on charges of manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, and leaving the scene of a deadly crash. The following morning, Karen Reed is arraigned in Norfolk County, and Trooper Paul goes to Fairview Road with Lieutenant Gallagher from Canton Police Department, uses a diagram from the CERT team to map out what he thinks happened. 1 year later, Toyota Techstream enters the picture, and Trooper Paul uses the trigger data to create a report claiming that Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe while driving 24 miles per hour in reverse for 62 feet, then continuing in reverse before leaving the scene. There are some issues with the diagram and mapping that Trooper Paul did, though, even before the Techstream data entered the picture. For starters, Trooper Paul said that he was told by Lieutenant Gallagher where John O'Keefe's body was found, and during cross-examination, Alan Jackson asked Trooper Paul if Gallagher ever mentioned to him that he never actually saw where John O'Keefe's body was found. He says that he was not told that, and Jackson goes on to point out that not only did Gallagher not see where he was located, but the first responder who did gave a different estimate on how far from the curb he was, putting him further into the yard than what Trooper Paul's diagram did. Also, Trooper Paul said that the distances that he calculated of the different pieces of evidence near him were measured from what he estimated to be John's center mass, But John was 6'2". He was a big guy, so some of the evidence could be off in measurements more than what's represented. There are also pieces that were not included in the diagram, including a piece of taillight that was found by the fire hydrant. Jackson really focuses in on this fact because Trooper Paul said that he determined the area of impact based on following the evidence back to the furthest piece from John's body. Jackson says if the furthest piece is 30 feet away, that changes the area of impact and now has the projection of John O'Keefe being much further than what he said. Trooper Paul says that he didn't say that the point of impact has to be where the furthest debris is, only that the path of it is how he determined it. But he does say that the impact would make the debris go in the same direction, which would be back and to the left, not forward. So there was never a clear explanation that was given on how that piece could have landed there based on Trooper Paul's theory. The taillight piece isn't listed on his diagram, and Trooper Paul said that he was told that there were 3 pieces of plastic, 2 red and 1 clear, not 5 pieces. So this piece that is the furthest is completely missing from the CERT team diagram that he based his mapping on. During cross, Jackson and Trooper Paul go back and forth about this, and Paul says that he cannot definitively say where the point of impact was. He can only determine that it was along the roadway in a linear area. Jackson says that based on where the taillight is, a linear fashion would mean close to the fire hydrant. So John O'Keefe would have had to have been projected 30 feet. And he asks, how is that possible? Trooper Paul says that projection doesn't mean he flew through the air. There would be a landing and a tumbling of some sort. But in one of the key moments in this cross that was big win for the defense, Trooper Paul says that there was no evidence that he flew through the air and no evidence that he rolled or tumbled. Generally, if there's a landing after a projection, there will be a second set of injuries from the impact of the landing. If there's a tumbling of some sort, there would be a second set of injuries for that. John O'Keefe had no injuries that match up to either of these. So, how did he get so far away? That question, how, is going to be a central theme of this entire episode as we outline the theories of what could have happened and what the prosecution is saying did happen. How is this possible? Or is it possible? In order to determine how something like this could or did happen, we rely on calculations. Science and math play a central role in this entire episode as we determine the possibility of what the prosecution is telling the jury happened. Let's start by getting an explanation as to exactly what crash reconstruction involves. This is Dr. Michael Wolf.
I think a simple definition in my mind would be the application of physics, engineering, science, and mathematics to collision events. I always like to think of it as if you open up a puzzle box and you dump the pieces out and you've got a bunch of pieces and you're trying to piece together the evidence to see how everything fits to get a clear picture.
So what are these different forms of physics, engineering, science, and math that are utilized in the testing and calculations? As they go through their testimonies, the ARCCA experts do a great job at breaking down what each area is and what it means. That's not surprising. They have extensive training and education in these fields. But Trooper Paul is noticeably not as comfortable or confident explaining this, which leads to some frustration during different times as he's being questioned on it. So, physics play a central role in the calculations of determining the theory of what happened, and also in determining if that theory is possible based on the evidence. Physics is a very broad category. It basically involves the study of everything in physical existence, from the smallest subatomic particles to the entire universe, and its motion and behavior through space and time, and how that motion and behavior is related to energy and force. So, basically, if outside energy and force act on something, it's what will or could happen. Pretty broad, I know, but let's break it down just a little because understanding this part is important in understanding the rest of this episode. A few key terms that are important here. The first is speed. We know what speed is. It's just how fast something's moving, right? But if you factor in a direction with the speed, then you get the velocity. How fast the velocity changes is called acceleration. But velocity is just the measurement of the rate and direction of motion. With the rate and direction of motion, the velocity, if you then factor in the mass of an object, that is what gives you momentum. So to give a very basic example, a train travels on average of about 40 miles per hour. And the average airspeed for birds ranges in the 10 to 40 miles per hour range. So imagine a tractor trailer sitting on a train track. Think about the damage that would be done if a train hit it. And then think about the damage that would be done if a bird hit it. Both have the same speed and direction, but the difference is the mass. A train usually weighs between 8,000 to 10,000 tons. That's huge, right? But a bird is usually weighed in grams or kilograms, depending on the type. Obviously, there are outliers, but we aren't talking about ostriches here for this example. But that gives you a basic idea of how much the mass can affect the momentum. So the momentum is used to predict the resulting direction and speed of motion of objects after they collide. So when one object is going a certain speed in a certain direction and has a certain weight, and then it collides with another object, if you also know that object's mass plus speed and direction if it is in motion, then you can calculate the momentum. Another example to illustrate this could be playing pool. Players are able to calculate the direction and speed a ball will go because of basic physics principles of speed and direction and momentum. You won't hit a ball really hard if you only need to tap it into a pocket that's close by. And you won't have to aim directly at the cue ball to go straight on if it needs to travel at an angle to hit the pocket. So here you have kind of an illustration of the geometry of motion that now comes into play because you're dealing with determining the direction that something will go on impact as well. These same physics and mathematical calculations are what the ARCCA experts used when testifying about Trooper Paul's theory. The momentum is calculated by multiplying the mass and the velocity, or speed and direction, of an object, and the geometry of it determines the direction that it will go. Let's also take a look at kinematics. Remember that during the testimony by the ARCCA experts, although they worked together on their testing, Dr. Wolf focused primarily on the damage to the car, and Dr. Rentschler focused primarily on the injuries to John O'Keefe. Those are based on different branches of science. While damage to the car is determined primarily on physics, injuries to the body also involve kinematics. Here's Dr. Rentschler giving a breakdown of what that is.
So kinematics is really just the motion of the human body, and it's the study of the human body, how the body moves under different circumstances, whether you're in a car that's struck from behind, what direction will your body move, slip and fall, how will your body rotate and move. It's really looking at the motion and the response of the body.
So if kinematics deals with how the human body will move and react, that would obviously be the main form of science used when determining if John's injuries were possible from the impact, and also where he was found in the yard compared to where the suggested point of impact was in the street. Lally asked Trooper Paul if he did any analysis with regard to kinematics, and all he says is that he did a kinematics analysis in his report, and it deals with the aspect of motion. Some of the key points of Trooper Paul's theory that we are going to discuss are related to kinematics, so we will hear more about this as we walk through this episode. So how familiar is Trooper Paul with the physics that are required to be able to calculate the things that are needing to be calculated here? Well, Lally asks him if he's familiar with the physics and kinematics of how pedestrians interact with vehicles in the course of a collision. And his response is basically just, yes, I am. But he doesn't go any further. Then Lally asks him to explain to the jury what physics are and how it pertains to any collision, starting with Newtonian physics and Newton's first law.
Now, I'm going to ask you just a couple of terminology questions when it comes to items that are involved in a collision, sort of simple Newtonian physics, Newton's first law. Can you explain what that is to the jury and sort of how that pertains to any collision between two objects?
The first law?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the when an object stays in motion or stays at rest, will stay at motion or rest until acted upon by an outside force.
Basic enough, right? If something isn't moving, it won't start moving until something makes it move. But during cross-examination, attorney Alan Jackson presses Trooper Paul on this. He wants to highlight exactly how much of an understanding Trooper Paul has when it comes to the actual calculations and forms of physics that would be required to make the calculations needed in accident reconstruction like this.
Define kinematics for the jurors.
It deals with the aspect of motion.
It's a subfield of what broader field?
Kinematics.
Kinematics is a subfield of what broader discipline of science?
I'm not sure.
Physics, correct?
Yes.
And it describes how points and objects and systems of objects, how they move, and how the rate they move and the rate of their velocity, correct?
It deals with emotions.
What's that called? The rate of velocity. What's another word for that?
The rate of velocity?
Correct.
I mean, it deals with the motion. It deals with forward, and also deals with speed. It deals with travel and speed. If something's moving, it also has a speed to it.
Right. The word you're looking for is acceleration, correct?
Sure.
What role does acceleration play in the field of kinematics?
What role does acceleration play in kinematics?
Correct.
It talks about, like you just said, it talks about the speed and talks about motion.
Is kinematics also known as the geometry of motion? Is that correct?
I have not heard that.
Never heard that. What's the difference between constrained and unconstrained motion?
Constrained and unconstrained motion?
That's what I asked.
Constrained motion. I can't recollect at the moment.
Constrained motion is motion on a predetermined path, isn't it?
Yes.
Unconstrained motion is what?
When it doesn't have a predetermined path?
Free movement, correct?
Correct.
You couldn't remember that from your class?
For the most part, we don't go that in depth of constrained and unconstrained.
Constrained and unconstrained, not restrained.
That's what I said. Sorry, unconstrained. Yes.
Do you actually understand the physics behind the study of kinematics?
Yes.
The word you learned in class.
Yes, we had to go over the physics part of it.
Jackson wants to get into the specifics here because these are the specifics that are used when calculating what is or is not possible with a pedestrian collision. By going through them in detail, he's highlighting to the jury Trooper Paul's lack of knowledge on these areas. Jackson then asked Trooper Paul about his testimony where he said that the half a mile per hour decrease in speed and steering input of less than 10 degrees is what he based his opinion on when he said that this was a pedestrian strike. Trooper Paul says that he said it was consistent with a pedestrian strike, and he also factored in the acceleration. But he reminds Jackson that on his reports, he does say that he cannot definitively say that this is where a pedestrian was struck. Jackson also points out that during his grand jury testimony, Trooper Paul told the jury that he came to his conclusions based on calculations and stuff. And he asks what the stuff was.
You were asked, does that remind you that you were asked by a grand juror if you could calculate how far a body would move having been struck by a vehicle?
Yes.
And you indicated, quote, yeah, there's certain calculations we can do with that. Would figure out if the car backed up, hit somebody, and then they go a certain amount of distance, and it's based on miles per hour, the speed of the vehicle, the striking vehicle, and stuff. Remember saying that?
Yes.
What did you mean by stuff?
I don't know.
You said that the calculations would be based on miles per hour and stuff. Did you ever do any stuff to test that? The grand juror's question.
No, we cannot calculate anything from this collision.
Say that one more time.
We cannot calculate anything from this collision.
Who's we?
I'm sorry, me. The role me.
Well, you know John O'Keefe's weight, right?
What's that?
You know John O'Keefe's weight, 217 pounds, right?
Yes.
Did you know that?
I don't know his weight, no.
You know the weight of the vehicle?
Yes.
What's the weight of the vehicle, gross weight?
What's the gross weight?
Yeah.
I think it's approximately 7,300 pounds.
Okay. Were you able to calculate the mass of the vehicle?
I did not calculate the mass of the vehicle.
Well, you told the grand jury that you were planning on doing that kind of stuff to calculate how far a person would travel being struck at that speed with a car of that weight. You didn't do those calculations?
No, because the calculations would vastly underestimate the speed of the vehicle.
You testified, again, my report isn't done yet. I'm going to look into it. I'm looking into all that stuff, end quote, correct?
Yes.
There's that word again. It's been more than 2 years since that statement at the grand jury. Is your report finished?
Yes, it is.
Did you engage in any of those calculations?
I looked into it. This type of collision I would not be able to use the formulas for this type of collision.
Well, let's talk about those formulas. How would you calculate how far a body at rest would travel after being struck by an object in motion? How would you calculate that?
In pedestrian collisions, I use a Searle throw formula.
A what formula?
Searle.
What does that mean?
It's a type of formula that we use for a calculation of post-impact or speeds for pedestrians.
That includes certain principles of physics to calculate that, right?
What do you mean?
I'm sorry?
What do you mean by certain forms of physics?
There would be physics calculations that would be required to figure out how far a body at rest would move having been struck by an object in motion. Right? That's a basic principle.
Yeah, I guess you could say, though.
All right. Can you describe for the jurors exactly what calculations you would need to employ to determine how far a body at rest would travel having been struck by an object in motion?
So, in this scenario, in this collision, it's more of a side swipe. So he did not ascertain. He did not get enough speed of the vehicle post impact with the vehicle to be able calculations. His center of mass was offset from the vehicle, so we would vastly underestimate his speed. So that's why I did not do a formula. If he was more in line with behind the vehicle, he would have been projected forward, and using that projection forward, he would have been able to get more closer to the actual speed of the vehicle during that post-impact travels.
Well, that presumes a couple of things, Trooper Paul. That presumes that he was quote unquote sideswiped, right?
Presumed?
Presumed by you. You didn't see how he was hit, did you?
Based on the evidence, it appeared to be a side swipe.
That's your opinion.
That's just reading the evidence.
You're saying that the principles of physics as we know them today in modern mathematics is thwarted by a sideswipe?
Objection.
Is that what you're saying?
It's the calculations that are out there. You can get a speed, it would just underestimate the speed.
You would have to know what the initial momentum of the object is that's in motion, correct?
Of what object?
The truck, Paul.
I would have to know that speed.
Yeah, you'd have to know what the initial momentum is, not speed, momentum. There's a difference.
Okay.
Right? Would you agree with that?
No.
So this gets a little bit difficult to listen to. Basically, all of the calculations that I mentioned earlier and how you determine the speed and then you factor in the direction and then the mass, and that's how you get the momentum. Trooper Paul is saying that he didn't do those and that they wouldn't really count because this is a side swipe instead of John being hit directly at his center of mass. We'll get into more of that in just a minute, but I just want to point out here that momentum is different than speed. Remember the bird and the train comparison? It's two very different things, and Jackson is trying to clarify here what Trooper Paul is saying, that modern mathematics and physics as we know them today are thwarted by a side swipe. We'll continue with this in just a moment. Warm weather and sunny skies are calling. Get ready for them with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. Factor can help you meet your health and wellness goals in time for your summer plans thanks to the menu of chef-crafted meals with options like Protein Plus, Keto, and my personal favorite, Calorie Smart. My schedule is crazy right now, but my Factor meals are ready to eat in just 2 minutes, which means I still get to enjoy nutritious, great-tasting meals that are fresh, never frozen, and dietitian approved. Make today the day that you kickstart a new, healthy routine. What are you waiting for? With 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, you'll always have new flavors to explore, so you never get tired of eating the same things. Crush your wellness goals with dietitian-approved meals and ingredients that you can trust. Make your day delicious from breakfast to dessert and stay fueled with easy, nutritious options. You can treat yourself to restaurant-quality meals that feature premium ingredients like filet mignon, shrimp, and blackened salmon. Keep kitchen time to a minimum. Factor meals are ready in only 2 minutes. There's no shopping, prepping, cooking, or cleaning up. You can enjoy effortless support for your lifestyle. Choose from 6 menu preferences to help you manage calories, maximize protein intake, avoid meat, or simply eat well balanced. head to factormeals.com/juror50 and use code juror50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month. That's code juror50 at factormeals.com/juror50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. Alan Jackson continues his questioning of Trooper Joe Paul. Jackson asks about the calculation for determining initial momentum, P equals m times v, or mass times velocity, and Trooper Paul tells Jackson that he would not use that when determining a pedestrian collision.
There's different types of momentum formulas.
Well, there's actually one type of momentum formula. It's to calculate momentum.
Objection.
Sustained. Isn't it true, Trooper Paul, that there is a singular calculation for determining initial momentum? That is P equals m times v, where P is the momentum. You're solving for that. M is mass. You multiply that by velocity. Is that right? Pretty simple.
You wouldn't use that in a pedestrian collision.
Oh, because the pedestrian's somehow magically out of the realm of physics?
Objection.
Sustained. Is a pedestrian out of the realm of physics and calculations?
No, it's the weight differential between the pedestrian and the vehicle.
So if the vehicle is too heavy and the body is too light, you can't calculate the initial momentum of the vehicle?
Yes.
Got it. Where'd you learn that?
It's in my math class. We only use momentum for a vehicle to vehicle.
Math class?
The crash reconstruction classes I have taken.
Got it.
When Lally asks Trooper Paul about his calculations, he brings up the Searle method, or pedestrian throw formula, and he asks Paul why these calculations would be applicable in a sideswipe collision versus some other type of collision. Trooper Paul says that it's not so much the formula, it's how much projection efficiency that would occur. He says in order for the formula to work, the more of the body or center mass that strikes the vehicle, the more efficient the outcome would be. I did some research on this method and formula. So the pedestrian throw formula was actually created in order to determine the speed of a car based on the distance that a pedestrian is thrown. The Searle method is said to be accurate to an acceptable degree, but the investigator must remember that they give a general indication of a vehicle speed rather than an absolute value, so it is desirable to confirm the findings with other evidence like skid marks and things like that. So Searle determined that pedestrians were launched into the air and then usually either bounced or rolled or slid to their final resting point. So he calculated the total distance covered by the pedestrian to the point of rest when determining the speed that the car was going when it hit the pedestrian. However, the Searle method largely ignores multiple variables, including the geometry of the car and the size of the pedestrian, among other things, which makes the validity and accuracy of the equation questionable, according to studies done by the University of Virginia Automobile Safety Laboratory, the Department of Machine and Vehicle Systems, Chalmers University of Technology, Honda R&D Company Limited, and Honda R&D Americas, Inc. So, basically, in order to make the pedestrian throw method work, you have to ignore variables that the ARCCA experts didn't ignore. And the Searle method is apparently considered appropriate mainly for wrap trajectories. According to the Traffic Accident Reconstruction Origin, a wrap trajectory is where the pedestrian is struck in the lower legs by the front of a vehicle, and the striking portion of the car must be lower than the height of the pedestrian. Then, upon impact, the legs buckle and the torso bends over the hood. Obviously, this is not what we're dealing with here. Jackson asked Trooper Paul how the discipline of physics cannot figure out how far John O'Keefe's body would move, but somehow he personally figured out how he would have somehow been projected 30 feet. Now, Trooper Paul isn't really able to give any kind of clarity on this, but he does repeat multiple times that the collision is a sideswipe, and that's why normal calculations would not be used. So, let's look at that a little bit. The first part of Trooper Paul's theory, the main part really, is that the collision was a sideswipe.
So, in this scenario, in this collision, it's more of a side swipe.
He had his arm holding a glass extended out to his side.
So it looks like his arm was more kind of like this. If I can try to get that.
You're indicating out by his side, correct?
Yes.
All right.
Which caused a dent in the back of the car.
The dent with the scratches for his hand could be, those are something that would be consistent with this in this particular case with striking the Lexus.
And shattered the taillight on impact.
Because when his arm struck the taillight then cracked.
The now cracked taillight caused abrasions on his arm.
And as the car is driving past him, the taillight could scratch it.
The impact projected him back into the left into the yard.
And in this situation where he gets more struck through the side of the vehicle on the taillight area, that it projected him to forward and into the left due to this like more of a side swipe manner.
This caused his shoe to come off.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon for pedestrians to lose essentially any sort of loose clothing. So, shoes, belts, hats, anything that's not very strapped on very well, could leave the body.
He suffered a head injury because he hit his head on the curb.
I noted at the scene that there was asphalt curbing, which could have somewhere he could have struck his head in there, or somewhere along any of the pavement would have caused damage.
Then came to a final resting spot in the yard, along with his phone and parts of a drinking glass.
Yeah, the glass could have struck the vehicle also in that same way. Could have still been attached to his hand and still gone with him in the same way. It could have been attached to his body in midair. That's the multiple ways that the glass would have stayed with him.
And based on the trigger data, he says that the car was moving at an accelerated speed.
The vehicle traveled up to 24 miles per hour and approximately 62 feet.
We've heard in the first half of this episode all about the science and calculations that Trooper Paul said he used when coming to his conclusions. Now, let's walk through this theory step by step and hear what the other experts say. First, the car hit John O'Keefe in a sideswipe motion.
It's a forward projection crash with a side swipe. And what I mean by forward projection means that when a pedestrian gets struck by a vehicle, well, basically their principal impact forces are above the pedestrian center of gravity, as in this case where you get the higher back of the vehicle. When you get struck by something like that, it projects you forward in the direction of the vehicle. And in this situation where he gets more struck through the side of the vehicle on the taillight area, that it projected him to forward and into the left due to this more of a side swipe manner.
Here's Dr. Rentschler discussing the side swipe.
So if there's a side swipe impact with a pedestrian in a vehicle, there's going to be very little damage to the pedestrian. And similarly, there's going to be very little movement. There's really no force at all acting. For instance, if a car came and swiped by your arm, but didn't have enough force or enough contact to cause any damage, well, it wouldn't actually cause any movement of the person either. So a side swipe by its very nature involves minimal impact, minimal forces, minimal velocities.
According to the experts, the side swipe is not possible. Trooper Paul said that John O'Keefe was holding his arm out at the time of impact, and the side swipe caused him to be projected into the yard.
Mr. O'Keefe was projected forward and to the left along the front yard of 34 Fairview Road.
Dr. Rentschler also goes into more detail about the projection, explaining why it could not happen the way that Trooper Paul described.
Is it consistent, in your view, with engineering principles and physics principles that you know, if an arm is hit, extended, not the body, just the arm is struck, for the body then to be projected?
It's not, no. So if we have contact, your arm's out, we have contact to the arm. I mean, first of all, it's a ball and socket joint. So the arm can move independently of the rest of the body. So with enough force, even if you're contracting your arm and trying to hold it out as tight as possible, it's going to overcome that muscular contraction and basically just move the arm. But secondly, it all depends on your center of mass. The center of mass is kind of the equilibrium point of your body of where your weight's distributed. And for most normal people, the center of mass occurs at your umbilicus or your belly button. So wherever your belly button goes, that's where your body's going to move. They teach this to football players, right? If you're a defensive back and a running back comes around the corner and it's you against him, they tell them or they teach them to watch the waist and watch the belly button. It doesn't matter what your head or your arms do or what their feet do. Wherever their belly button goes, that's where they're going to go. So that's what you want to tackle. So even if you had your arm straight out, again, we said it would move because of the joint. But let's assume you had a metal pole sticking out of your arm, out of your body instead of your arm, and that metal pole gets hit. What's going to happen to your body? It's just going to spin around, right? Because it's producing a moment arm, which produces a torque on the body. So your body's going to basically spin. In order to get that body, or the complete body, over, for instance, 10, 20, 30 feet into the yard, you need a force acting at the center of mass. You need an external force pushing the body that way. And that's not going to happen if you just hit the arm. It's not enough force. It's not the right mechanism to actually cause the body to somehow move that far over.
Furthermore, if projected, you would expect another set of injuries from landing. You're going to get initial contact and injuries, and then if it propels you into the air, you're going to get airborne, and then you're going to contact the ground, usually with the opposite side of your body. So then you're going to see a correlation of injuries to the other side of your body as it slams down on the ground as well. And at these speeds, he says normally you would also see more abrasions, greater abrasions or road rash along the entire part of the body, because the body would then slide until it came to the point of rest. Dr. Kenneth Kinsey is a crime scene reconstructionist who has been qualified as an expert in bloodstain patterns, crime scene investigation, and crime scene reconstruction, among other fields. His education, experience, and training qualified him to testify in the trial of Alex Murdaugh, and as the expert scene reconstructionist, he ultimately helped lead to the conviction of Murdaugh for the murders of his wife Maggie and his son Paul. Dr. Kinsey is also a friend of mine, so I was able to ask his input on some of these topics as well. Here's what he had to say about the sideswipe theory.
If you were sideswiped in a low impact, low speed incident, you would turn counterclockwise, or depending on which side of the car you were on and which way you were facing. But in this scenario, I believe you would turn counterclockwise. But you would not have the injuries you have here. And certainly that plastic tail lens would not create those injuries on the victim's arm. So, a little bit of accuracy and theory there, but we talked about it earlier. If you're hit below that midline, of course, you're going to be under the vehicle. If you're hit about midway, you're going to have those two collisions that we talked about. The vehicle hits you, and then your body hits the vehicle. And then, of course, if you're up high, you're going to see what we typically see, where you're thrust into the air or you cartwheel down the road if the driver of the vehicle can stop in time. And that's it. That's physics. That doesn't change. And I just don't think you could have the speed or the force. This is a big guy. I don't think the force would have been enough to eject him, 20 feet or so. I just don't think.
According to the experts, the projection was not possible. Trooper Paul said that John's arm was held out to the side when he was struck by Karen Reed's SUV, and the arm and the shoulder took the brunt of the hit. He holds his arm out to demonstrate the position that it was in, and he says that position will account for the small dent and scratches in the back of the car on the lift gate.
Was his arm out and it just struck the arm like a hinge? Was it in front of him? You did the reconstruction? It shows exactly how his body was positioned when he was struck by that.
So it looks like his arm was more kind of like this, if I can try to get that.
You're indicating out by his side, correct?
Yes.
All right. And the tail light would have struck his arm, right?
Yes.
Not his torso.
Yes.
Okay.
Jackson asked Dr. Wolf about this positioning, and Dr. Wolf explains that the tail light facing the rear is only about 6.5 inches wide. The rest of it curves around the car. So the dent and the paint chips above the liftgate are approximately 20 inches from the right side of the car. In that 20-inch area, there's another lamp assembly on the liftgate itself and a chrome trim piece just above that. And then there's, of course, the body paneling to the liftgate itself. Between the dent and the fractured taillight, there was no observable damage to that area, which would be expected had an arm been positioned there holding a drinking glass.
Is the absence of the damage that you described, between the dent and the rest of the vehicle, with the exception of the taillight, is that consistent or inconsistent with striking an outstretched arm of a human being?
Objection.
I'll allow that.
That would be inconsistent in my opinion.
I also asked Dr. Kinsey about the arm being outstretched.
The part that got me is, his arm was out and he was sideswiped, and that you end up with a broken arm. But it seems to me a broken arm wouldn't have got us to where we're at now. So the part about his arm out, we spoke about this months ago when this thing first kicked off. I definitely do not believe that's the way it happened. If that car backed up as far as they say it did, well, my hands are going to be empty to start with because I'm going to try to push off the car unless I didn't see it. And if I didn't see it, what would the purpose of my arm? Why would my arm be out? So, I mean, it's just a lot of theories. And then when they probed them on it and tried to dig a little bit deeper, they didn't have answers. And I'm not saying make those answers up, but you have to think from every direction when you're doing your trial prep. And I just don't think that was here. And maybe a peer review process would have said, would have told him that that's not good. We've got to go back to the drawing board and figure out what really happened because that's not accurate.
According to the experts, John's arm being extended and causing a dent in the car was not possible. Trooper Paul says that the car sideswipes John, causing his shoe to come off. Lally and Trooper Paul point out that a shoe coming off is common in a pedestrian collision.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon for pedestrians to lose essentially any sort of loose clothing. Shoes, belts, hats, anything that's not very strapped on very well, could leave the body.
Lally asked Dr. Wolf about this.
If it's more of a sideswipe type interaction, if we're just talking about an arm, for instance, contacting the vehicle, no, I would not expect the shoe to come off. If it's something where the entire body is interacting with the vehicle, then yes, there's a greater likelihood that something like a shoe will come off, yes.
I also asked Dr. Kinsey about the force required to bring John O'Keefe out of his shoes.
Generally, you're correct with the force, but it's actually friction. Shoes are usually ejected due to the friction and any movement, of the victim itself. This pedestrian vehicle contact, if that's what it is, I don't believe it would create enough force or friction to do that. And once again, it's where the person is struck. Had Mr. O'Keefe been struck down low really, really fast, maybe. The momentum of feet going overhead could have ejected those shoes, but I wouldn't really expect it here. And I've had some troopers tell me, in almost every crash I've worked, and I just find that hard to believe. I think it matters the type of shoe, certainly that friction, and then how did the decedent or the victim react after they were hit? If they went down, why would their shoes be ejected? Or if they had a double impact and went over the vehicle, I could see it. Or certainly if they were hit and projected down the road in the same direction as the force. But I wouldn't expect that here. Could happen, maybe not. I mean, if he's in some slides or, sandal type shoes, but I know it's very, very cold when this happened. That is a little suspect to me. And I would have to have an answer for that also, because athletic type shoes are not going to come off that easy unless you're older like me and you got the ones with the Velcro. I'm just kidding, but they don't come off that easy, and it takes a lot of force to do it. And once again, we're not talking about that much force in this suggested vehicle versus pedestrian accident.
So according to the experts, John O'Keefe's shoe would not have come off. What else can we tell about the theory of the car striking John O'Keefe on the arm? Jackson pushed Trooper Paul on how he can explain no fractures or broken bones and not even a bruise. But the objections were sustained, and Trooper Paul didn't have to answer that. Here's Trooper Paul explaining the injuries to John's arm.
The full mass, the full weight of that truck hit him basically at the elbow. Is that right? Missing his torso.
But I said it, from upper part of the arm down.
The elbow and the biceps.
I didn't see anything that shows an indication that this lower torso was struck, but
So
it's not saying it could not have been a possibility, but I just didn't see anything.
So his torso was spared from being hit, but the arm took the brunt, the full force of the vehicle, correct?
Like arm and shoulder, yes.
Okay. And you said he then did a spin, like a sort of a pirouette?
He got spun around possibly the way he struck, it looked like it could have turned around counterclockwise.
Okay. So if he turns around counterclockwise, is he turning around in the air counterclockwise?
Yes, initially.
So he gets hit on the upper biceps, shoulder area, and down to the forearm, right?
Yes.
By an unbroken taillight, right?
Yes.
In other words, it's nice and smooth. Nothing, no shards of plastic or anything broken at the time that it made contact with his arm, right?
Correct.
Okay. So how did his arm get all cut up?
Because when his arm struck the taillight then cracked, and as the car driving past him, the taillight could scratch it.
Got it.
So is that possible? Here's Dr. Rentschler.
So again, I would expect to see significant trauma to the skin, to the bone, to the tendons. I wouldn't expect to see just abrasions, pattern abrasions. I mean, abrasion by very definition means that it's trauma to the skin, which is created through rubbing or grinding or friction. So it's basically something rubbing against the skin that basically wears away that top layer of skin. It's not blunt force trauma. If you have blunt force trauma, that produces a contusion or a bruising. It's not a laceration type injury where you have a cutting injury that actually produces a cut or a significant laceration. It's really just rubbing along the skin. So that would be inconsistent. If you have an arm that's actually struck at 25 miles an hour, you're going to have significantly greater damage, especially if there's a taillight that shatters. So you have the taillight coming in, it's hitting the arm, and it's moving forward into the arm. So if that actually caused fracturing of the taillight, then parts of that taillight are going to be pushed into the arm and likely embedded into the arm as the vehicle continues forward and pushes the arm out of the way. I didn't see any of that, basically just superficial abrasions, which all appear to have a similar amount of force. There's not a difference. That's the other thing. If you had a taillight shatter and explode on an arm, you would have some areas where you would have very deep contusions or lacerations, others lighter areas. But when you look at the abrasions that were noted in this case, they all appear to be of the same force, generally the same direction and the same severity, which would be inconsistent, in my opinion, with being struck at 25 miles an hour.
And of course, I also asked Dr. Kinsey.
I don't see it from the light. I'm not saying it's not possible because, maybe that's something an engineer could tell you. And in this case, they had a very well-established engineering and crash firm. And obviously, they said it didn't happen that way, too. But I've never seen any kind of injury like that caused by tail ends. I just haven't seen it.
So according to the experts, the arm injuries coming from hitting the taillight are not possible. But what about the damage to the car itself? Here's Trooper Paul explaining specifically how the light was shattered.
Let me ask you this. Based on your reconstruction, nearly 2-year investigation, exactly how was that taillight shattered? Explain it to us.
How does the taillight? What do you? It gets so the taillight in this case was shattered when it was struck John O'Keefe's arm.
Exactly what part of his arm?
Based on what I saw for his injuries, was from the upper part of his arm down.
So, is it possible for the taillight to have shattered like this if it made contact with John O'Keefe's arm at 24 miles an hour? Dr. Wolf explains that the damage to the car was all really confined to a very isolated portion of the car. There was no damage to the bumpers or the panels, the quarter panel, the sheet metal. All of that was remarkably intact. There's usually some sort of bumper displacement and or sheet metal deformation. Impact will often sometimes cause the bumper to also kind of become unmounted or unclipped. And he said that you could certainly see deformation of the body paneling, such as the liftgate or the cord panels. But there was none of that. Because the damage was so isolated, the ARCCA doctors decided to do some testing to see what was possible and under what conditions. They did what they call a drop test, using dummies to evaluate the forces of an interaction between the taillight from the Lexus and a human head. Now, they did this testing because of the fracture on the back of John's head, but Dr. Rentschler explains that a head and an arm will weigh almost exactly the same thing in this case, so the testing will work for both. So they dropped the dummy head from 7.5 feet because if you calculate it through physics and the acceleration due to gravity, that would equate to an impact of 15 miles per hour at that height. So Dr. Rentschler says that in reverse, 15 miles an hour is fast. He said if you've ever looked at your speedometer when you're pulling into your driveway or reverse into a parking stall, for example, most people don't go more than 5 miles an hour or so. So 15 miles an hour in reverse is fast, especially when you're talking about nighttime in winter conditions on potentially wet or icy roads. So that speed would actually be on the high end for going in reverse. Now, at 15 miles an hour, you start to see significant injuries to the human body when it makes contact with the vehicle. So from a damage perspective, the 15 mile an hour interaction between the hybrid head form dummy and the test tail light produced significantly more damage than what was seen on Karen's car. So if the damage to Karen's car was less, but the speed was much more, that obviously doesn't really make sense. And based on the damage they saw at 15 miles per hour, the doctor said if you did the speed at 24 miles an hour, you're looking at significantly more kinetic energy. Probably 2.5 times more energy than the 15 mile per hour test, which means 2.5 times the damage to the taillight, which obviously we know didn't happen. So from a damage standpoint, he said it's clear that this is inconsistent with the damage to the taillight being caused by striking John O'Keefe. I also asked Dr. Kinsey what damage he saw on the car that was consistent with having struck John O'Keefe.
I saw none of it. I saw no damage that would, Mr. O'Keefe was my size, a little bit taller. I don't see it. I just do not see damage. A tail lens is not going to do it. And I know because, I've got a couple little dings in my new truck, and it doesn't take a lot to dent the metal that's on the trucks now. Most of them are aluminum. I just don't see it, Miss Brandy. And I wish I could give an answer. But at 20 miles an hour, if you back your SUV up and I just hold my fist out, there's going to be a dent in your vehicle. And it's not here. So that tells me it's got to be lower than the bumper, if at all.
So according to the experts, the taillight shattering because it hit John O'Keefe is not possible. So if John O'Keefe's arm didn't cause the damage to the taillight, what could have? Dr. Wolf says that based on the isolated portion of damage being confined to the taillight, he knew that they were dealing with potentially a small object that broke the lens. And since there were 2 apparent glass fragments located on the top bumper cover and a drinking glass that was found, they thought maybe John threw a glass to break the taillight. So he and one of the lab techs at ARCCA designed and developed a pressurized air cannon to test this out.
Myself and one of our lab technicians at ARCCA, we designed and developed a pressurized air cannon. So it was capable of firing a projectile such as a drinking glass at the taillight. So it essentially, you can think of it kind of as a giant cannon, but it had a barrel, and then there was a valve that would open rapidly, and directly behind that was a pressurized vessel. And depending on the pressure, the PSI of that vessel, would determine essentially the speed at which that glass would be projected into the taillight.
So you literally built a cannon?
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
This dude literally built a cannon. How cool of a job is that? Dr. Wolf said that they performed 2 different tests in terms of speed, and their target speeds were 30 and 40 miles per hour because Dr. Rentschler indicated that this is a reasonable speed at which an adult individual could throw a drinking glass at the taillight. They wanted to test to see when a projectile such as a drinking glass interacted with the taillight, would they be able to get damage on the test taillight consistent with that of Karen's taillight. So they actually were able to replicate the damage. The achieved speeds were 31 miles per hour and 37 miles per hour. And at the 37 mile per hour test, they were able to create damage that was consistent with the damage to Karen's car, both on the fractured and missing or broken pieces, and the underlying damage to some of the internal components as well. Next, let's talk about John's head injury. Here's what Trooper Paul says happened.
I noted at the scene that there was asphalt curbing, which could have, somewhere he could have struck his head in there, or somewhere along any of the pavement would have caused damage.
The problem with the curb is that he's already said in his theory that John flew back and to the left, not back onto the street. So how would he have hit his head on the curb? They also try to explain this by saying that he could have hit his head on the frozen ground. And Lally asked Dr. Rentschler during cross-examination about this, but I don't think that he realized that it's a lot more complicated than just saying that the ground is frozen because it's snowing.
Well, you'd have to perform an analysis, actually, because you'd have to determine how hard that ground was. You'd have to look at the freeze and thaw cycle, probably leading up to weeks of that. You can't just look at ground and say, well, it's below freezing, so that ground must be frozen. I mean, is it a possibility? It may be, but you have to go through an actual analysis and procedure to determine how hard that ground is and whether it could have produced those injuries.
So it is something that's capable of being done by you, is that correct?
Performing that type of an analysis? Yes. You could go through and do it, sure, yeah.
And you didn't do it, correct?
No, I did not do it, no. Because, yeah, there's no need in this case. We don't know what happened in this case. There's no indication of, certainly, it's not consistent with getting hit by the car and ending up where he did, even if the ground is somehow hard enough to cause that type of an injury. Again, there's no movement and no force to get his body over there, and then the damage with the car is inconsistent with him being struck by it.
I also asked Dr. Kinsey about the head injuries.
If he was located at the curb, I would have a lot easier time believing that. Or as I mentioned earlier, if someone could provide some type of corroborated evidence that he got up, Officer O'Keefe got up and walked off. Yeah, but I don't think so. And the medical professional should know the difference, in the different concussions. Of course, that's way beyond my scope, but you deal with it a lot. And I think it also goes back with damage to the vehicle. So if it's not the curb and there's no damage to the vehicle, then where did it come from?
So according to the experts, the head injury in this case, coming from the frozen ground, is also not possible. Finally, let's talk about John O'Keefe's cell phone and the glass pieces that were found near him. I played the clip earlier of Trooper Paul explaining that the glass traveled with John O'Keefe after he was supposedly struck by the car while holding it, or how it could have attached to his body mid-air, according to Trooper Paul. He tells Lally that items on impact will travel in a linear motion, going the same direction as the pedestrian when they are hit. When Jackson asks him about this, he says that there are multiple ways that it could have gotten there, but he doesn't know because he wasn't there.
I don't know. I wasn't there, so I don't know how the glass stayed with his body and went with him to the final rest.
So it's just common sense. You have to believe that it was in his hand. He held on to it the entire time it was being projected 30 feet, right?
It could have been in his hand. It could have been tucked next to his clothing. Did
you say tucked into?
Could have been next to his body. So when he projected, maybe the glass was with his body as it was also flying. So there's a number of reasons why the glass, because it also got projected with the body while he was holding it.
I thought you said on Friday, and you just agreed with me, that people drop things when they're hit.
Yes, not everything it tends to fly off. Some stuff flies off, some stuff will stay on.
I see.
He also asks about how John O'Keefe's cell phone was found underneath him.
How about his cell phone?
Cell phone? Yeah. Yeah, it depends. Depends on where it is.
It was under his body.
Okay.
How do you account for that? He held onto his cell phone with one hand and held onto the cup with the other.
Objection. Sustained. Ask it differently.
If his cell phone was found under his torso, under his body, what's your theory on how that cell phone ended up flying 30 feet with him?
It just did.
Just did. And somehow, as he landed, tucked that cell phone underneath his body so he landed on top of it.
It just did. That's the evidence at the scene. I didn't put the evidence there. So.
Well, you didn't.
That last comment brought an objection by Lally and a scolding by the judge. Jackson isn't getting any clear answers from Trooper Paul about how he explains these things in his theory. It just is, and I wasn't there so I don't know, aren't really doing much for clarification purposes. So he continues to question him.
You testified that you noted glass on the rear bumper of the SUV, correct?
Yes.
And you said something about that glass coming from the cup.
Correct.
You also said that you did not see anything on that SUV that could be the source of those glass pieces on the bumper, right?
Yes.
When you did your reconstruction and your analysis, were you informed that none of the glass pieces, not one of them, could be matched to a cup?
I don't know anything about I don't know that.
So if you knew that the glass pieces on the bumper do not match the cup, would that change your opinion
Objection.
about that glass?
Can you answer that question?
I cannot.
You can't answer the question?
It's what was told to me as evidence.
Got it. By whom?
By the crime scene.
Who told you?
As crime scene that was there, it says there's glass from the cup. When I did my initial inspection, that's what it was on from.
That's not what you just said. You said that's what was told to me.
Yeah, by crime. No, yeah, I can see by crime scene. While I was at my inspection.
Wait, what?
It was told to me by the crime scene when I was at my inspection, at the initial inspection.
So what you meant by that's what was told to me is the crime scene talked to you?
Yes.
Crime scene say anything else?
I don't know what else you want me to say.
The final part of Trooper Paul's theory is that the car was going in reverse at 24.2 miles per hour for 62 feet. Here's Dr. Rentschler explaining the damage that would be done at that speed.
Generally speaking, what injuries would you expect to see in a vehicle-pedestrian interaction at, say, 24 miles per hour?
Objection.
I'll allow that. Just generally, Doctor, if you would, please.
Yes, Your Honor. So 24 miles an hour, once you get up to that speed, you start to see fractures. You see significant ligament and tendon damage. Usually about 15 mile an hour impact is where you start to see damage to, for instance, the leg and the knee. At that speed, you're going to produce, if you impact the vehicle, you're going to produce upwards of 1,000 pounds of force on the body, depending on what part of your body impacts the vehicle. So certainly at 25 miles an hour, you start to see significant injuries occur.
So was the taillight damage consistent or inconsistent with striking an arm?
It was, our findings was it's inconsistent for a number of reasons, but it's inconsistent with striking the arm. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Piece by piece, the experts went through every single aspect of Trooper Paul's theory and completely destroyed it. Their conclusions were that nothing that he said was possible through the physics and the science, and they were able to clearly articulate why not. Lally was not happy with this, and during cross-examination, he asked each of the doctors about the information that they based their findings on, asking about the things that they didn't receive, like Trooper Paul's crash reconstruction report or the DNA analysis. Since Trooper Paul's entire report has been completely debunked, I'm not sure why it would matter that they had that, but they did discuss the DNA.
When was it that you looked at this additional material and who provided it to you?
We were informed after the report was issued that DNA was found. And that was really the primary issue. I believe that some DNA was found on the housing, which, again, there's numerous explanations or ways that DNA can get on a light housing.
Dr. Rentschler goes on to say that the DNA that was found was a small amount and there was no blood, so it didn't really change his opinion. I also asked Dr. Kinsey about the DNA.
Well, we're obviously talking about some form of touch DNA because there's no body fluids, no lipids, no skin, no visible skin. Partial profiles usually with touch DNA and not very strong numbers. When you look at the ratios, it's very, very fragile. He'd ridden in that vehicle. He'd ridden in that vehicle on the passenger side. You can't age it. Who's to say, his DNA probably would be expected to be on that vehicle. If he did any maintenance to it or, because of the weather, he wiped it down, he did anything. I don't believe that's very strong. And, it really, I don't know, it doesn't mean a lot to me. When you look at the percentages, it's not really, really strong. So I don't know. Is it his? Is it not his? How did it get there? When did it get there? You don't know. And I believe that's an unanswered question that I don't think any DNA analyst can answer. And of course, you use it with other pieces of evidence to get a totality. And to me, that still doesn't change my mind about there being some major issues here.
Dr. Kinsey also says that John O'Keefe having a hoodie on will impact the strength of the DNA being considered strong evidence.
Think about it this way. Striking his arm, the DNA doesn't jump through garments. So, that's another thing too.
Dr. Kinsey also talks about touch DNA on the taillight.
Touch DNA can transfer, and that is true. Couldn't someone have taken so-and-so's DNA and then deposited here, not on purpose, but inadvertently? And the answer from any qualified DNA analyst is going to be certainly that there is a possibility that can happen. If they didn't change gloves, if they collected anything on the vehicle, there's always that possibility. But my thing is, what does it mean? He got out of the vehicle.
Lally also asks about the hair and the mitochondrial DNA testing. This is something that I asked Dr. Kinsey's opinion on as well.
And a single hair. You and I live in areas of the country where we have a lot of deer strikes. Mm-hmm. And I've probably hit more than my share, but I don't recall ever seeing a single hair. It's usually a lot of hair or a lot of body fluids. Then again, he got out of the passenger side. No one ever said he didn't ride in that vehicle. We're constantly shedding skin, cells, hair daily. I don't know that means a lot to me. And if someone planted that, they really didn't do their research, but I'm not saying it happened or it didn't happen, but not a lot in that. It's replicated and it's a numbers game when you're doing mitochondrial. So what does it really mean? If they said he'd never seen this vehicle, never ridden in this vehicle, I'd say, wow, that is really a smoking gun. But what does it really mean?
Lally went through with the doctors listing more things that they didn't know, most of which had zero impact on their testing and analysis. I think that this was not so much a way to ask them what they had or didn't have, but more of a way to list out for the jury all of the circumstantial evidence that we've discussed before so that they may forget this testimony and how bad it is for his case. A lot of the things they knew about, like the hat and the shoe, and that they were at a bar that night. Most of it was irrelevant, like asking if they knew about statements that Karen allegedly made that she hit him, or if they knew that she said that she saw John's body first, or that there was video of John leaving the bar at 12:11. On redirect, Alan Jackson asks if any of these things make a difference in his opinion on this, and the answer was absolutely not. Dr. Wolf's final conclusions are that the damage to the car is not consistent with having made contact with John O'Keefe. Dr. Rentschler's final conclusions are that John O'Keefe's injuries are not consistent with having made contact with the car. In other words, the car did not hit John O'Keefe, and John O'Keefe was not hit by the car. As far as the head injury goes, Dr. Rentschler said that there's not enough evidence to determine what caused that. It could be a fall, it could be a baseball bat, or a million other things, but there's no evidence that supports that it was caused as a result of being hit by Karen Reed's car and then hitting his head on the ground as a result. Lally tries one more time to suggest that the reason that the doctor thinks this is because he didn't have enough evidence, but Dr. Rentschler shut that down, saying that even with the additional evidence, it doesn't change their conclusions.
You didn't have enough evidence based on what you were provided. Isn't that fair to say?
I didn't have enough evidence based on what I was provided, and even looking at the additional evidence that I became aware of after the fact, there's still no evidence. I mean, you can't deny the science and the physics as to what would have happened if he was struck by the vehicle. So anything past that, you have to somehow overcome that hurdle, which is very difficult to do.
So that is the final witnesses. I could honestly spend another 3 hours going over the details of these 3 Reconstructionists and comparing their testimony. And maybe we'll have a chance to look into it more down the road. But I wanted to take our time going through the specifics of Trooper Paul's testimony and comparing it with the experts, hitting the most important aspects of it. On the next episode, we'll get into the closing arguments. That's the attorney's final chance to address the jury, and I'll fill you in on what went on with the jury after that. There was drama inside the courtroom as well as outside the courtroom, with protesters, pictures that have been circulating on the internet that nobody can agree on when it comes to authenticity and metadata, and all of the drama that has gone on since then. If you thought that this saga was coming to an end, buckle up, y'all. It's far from over. My name is Brandy Churchwell, creator of 13th Juror Podcast. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share this episode with your friends. For more information, photos, and episode guides, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com.